The story unfolds in the heart of an ancient Alaskan forest, where towering pines and spruce trees stand like silent sentinels, shrouded in a mist that clings to the ground. John, a seasoned forest ranger with years of experience navigating the wilderness, moved through the dense undergrowth with practiced ease. The crunch of his boots against the frosty ground was the only sound until an unusual noise pierced the tranquil air. It wasn't the rustle of branches or the call of a bird, but something raw and desperate, a sound that made him freeze mid-step. John's pulse quickened as he tilted his head, listening intently. His instincts, honed by years of protecting these woods, told him this was no ordinary cry. Somewhere deep in the forest, an animal was in trouble, its plaintive wails carried on the biting wind. Adjusting his pack and gripping his flashlight, John followed the sound, his heart pounding with a mixture of concern and curiosity. The haunting cry grew louder as John pressed deeper into the forest, the dense foliage clawing at his jacket and the icy air stinging his cheeks. Every step felt heavier as the sound sharpened into a guttural moan filled with pain and panic. His flashlight beam sliced through the shadows, revealing the snow-dappled forest floor and the faint trail of disturbed earth that led him to the source of the distress. Finally, in a small clearing, his breath caught in his throat. Before him stood a grizzly bear, a massive, majestic creature brought low by a cruel twist of fate. Its powerful legs were ensnared in barbed wire, the sharp metal cutting into its flesh, leaving trails of dark, dried blood on its thick fur. Even more horrifying, a crude noose encircled its neck, digging deep into its hide with every strained movement. The bear thrashed weakly, its growls filled with agony and exhaustion, its dark eyes reflecting both fear and fury. The sight was both heartbreaking and terrifying. A creature of the wild, rendered helpless by human cruelty. John's instincts screamed at him to retreat. A trapped bear was unpredictable and dangerous, its desperation amplifying the threat it posed. But he couldn't tear his eyes away. Years of working as a ranger had taught him to respect the power of nature, to tread carefully around its creatures. Yet, this was different. The bear wasn't just a wild animal now. It was a victim. Someone had set this trap, someone who didn't care about the suffering they caused. And now the responsibility to help fell squarely on John's shoulders. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, his mind racing through the risks. Approaching the bear could end in disaster. A single swipe of its massive paw could be lethal, but leaving it here, to die slowly and painfully, wasn't an option he could live with. Taking a deep breath, he scanned the scene again, calculating his next move. He spoke softly, almost instinctively, as though the bear could understand his words. "Easy, big guy. I'm here to help." The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, its growling pausing for a moment before resuming with renewed vigor. John dropped his pack to the ground and rummaged for his gloves and wire cutters, his hands trembling slightly. He knew this was going to be one of the most dangerous things he'd ever attempted, but there was no turning back now. The grizzly's frantic movements only intensified as John crouched, his heart pounding in his chest. The bear's eyes, wide with terror and confusion, locked onto him with an intensity that made every muscle in his body tighten. It could feel the presence of a threat. And though John's intentions were to help, to the bear, he was just another predator. In the rawness of the moment, the air seemed to thicken with tension, and John could almost hear his own heartbeat drumming in his ears. He needed to make it clear. He wasn't a threat. John's first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but as his hand brushed against the cold metal, he froze. He didn't want to escalate the fear that already gripped the bear. Slowly, deliberately, He unstrapped the rifle from his back and allowed it to fall to the forest floor with a soft thud. The sound seemed to reverberate in the stillness, but the bear, to his relief, didn't lunge or charge. It was watching him closely, its breath coming in ragged gasps, its body trembling from exhaustion and fear. John, his hands trembling but steady with resolve, spoke again, his voice calm and low, trying to penetrate the panic that had taken hold of the creature. "It's okay. I won't hurt you. I'm here to help." For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the bear's labored breathing and the crackling of the snow beneath John's boots as he moved forward. The air between them felt charged, as though either one of them could snap at any moment. Yet John's steady gaze never wavered from the bear's dark, wild eyes. He took a few careful steps closer, inching toward the injured animal. His boots made no sound on the soft snow as he moved, and he tried to make himself as small and non-threatening as possible. When he was close enough, he could see the full extent of the bear's suffering. The barbed wire wrapped tightly around its legs, cutting deep into the flesh, the jagged edges of metal gleaming faintly in the beam of his flashlight. The noose around its neck was cruel, digging deeper with every panicked thrash. The bear let out another strained growl, its powerful body quivering. But it didn't try to lunge this time. Instead, it seemed almost resigned, too worn down to fight further. John's breath came in shallow gasps as he reached for the wire cutters strapped to his belt, his mind still racing through the risks. He knew he was walking a razor-thin line. One wrong move, one sudden shift from the bear, and everything could go wrong. But John had never been one to back down from a challenge, especially one involving a life in peril. His hands, though shaking, moved with practiced precision as he started to carefully work at the barbed wire. Each snip of the wire echoed in the quiet forest like a small victory. But John knew it was only the beginning. The bear flinched as the wire was freed from its legs, but it didn't fight. It was as though it could sense that John wasn't trying to cause harm, that he was focused only on easing its pain. John kept his movements slow and deliberate, his voice soft and continuous as he spoke to the bear. "I know this hurts, but I'm almost there. You'll be okay." He could feel the weight of those words pressing on him, the promise of something better, even if it was uncertain. The forest around them seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them in this raw, fragile moment. Despite the looming danger, John couldn't help but feel a deep well of compassion rising within him. He had seen a lot in his years as a ranger injured animals, tragic accidents, and the often harsh realities of nature. But nothing had ever felt quite like this. This wasn't about duty anymore. It was about saving a life, about reaching out in the face of fear and pain, and hoping that something good could come from it. With the last of the barbed wire finally cut free, John took a step back, his breath heavy in his chest, expecting the bear to react in the only way it knew, by running. The bear, its legs still trembling from the ordeal, seemed to hesitate for a moment, its massive body shifting unsteadily. John watched, his heart racing, as the creature, now free of its torment, seemed to gather its strength. The forest fell eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath the bear's paws. But then, as if the weight of the ordeal had finally caught up with it, the bear's body buckled. The enormous animal's legs, still weak and battered from the pain of the wire and noose, gave way, and with a low, exhausted grunt, it collapsed onto the snow. The ground seemed to tremble slightly under the bear's massive frame, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of labored breathing. John's breath caught in his throat as he realized the bear wasn't getting up. It wasn't fleeing. It was too exhausted, too injured. His heart sank as he took in the full extent of the bear's condition. Its paw, once trapped in the barbed wire, was now raw and bleeding. But there was more. The bear's body trembled with pain, and its breathing was shallow, labored. John knew this wasn't just a bear that had been caught in a trap. It was a creature on the edge of collapse, struggling to survive after what had been a long and torturous ordeal. The barbed wire had cut deep into its flesh, and the noose had constricted its neck, likely causing internal injuries as well. The momentary sense of relief John had felt from freeing the bear quickly gave way to a sharp sense of urgency. This wasn't over yet. The bear was in far worse shape than he'd first realized, and he couldn't leave it here, vulnerable and at the mercy of the wilderness. Without a second thought, he pulled the radio from his belt, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline and the weight of the situation. The frequency was a local wildlife rescue clinic, his best hope of getting the bear the immediate care it needed. He clicked the button and spoke quickly, his voice steady, despite the panic rising within him. "This is Ranger John Evans. I've got a grizzly in distress, badly injured. I need help now." There was a crackling pause before the voice of the dispatcher came through, calm but urgent. "Copy that, John. What's the situation? Over. The bear's been trapped in a hunter's snare. Its legs are torn up from barbed wire. It's collapsed, can't stand. It's in a bad way. I'm near the East Ridge, about 2 miles from the main trail. You'll need to move quickly. This bear's in severe distress." John's voice was clipped, but every word was laced with the urgency of the situation. The dispatcher responded with a reassuring tone. "We'll send a team, John. Stay with the animal and try to keep it calm. We'll be there as soon as we can. Over." John nodded, even though he knew they couldn't see him. He clipped the radio back onto his belt and turned his full attention back to the bear. It was still lying on the ground, its breathing shallow but steady. Despite the exhaustion etched into every part of its massive form, the bear seemed to recognize that John wasn't a threat. It didn't try to fight or retreat. Instead, it lay there, its head resting heavily on the snow, its eyes half closed in a mixture of pain and weariness. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and John couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. He'd done what he could to free the bear, but now the battle was far from over. The wilderness around him, vast and untamed, felt like a reminder that even the strongest creatures could falter. And in that moment, John knew the bear's survival was no longer just in its own paws. It rested in his hands, too. He crouched near the animal, speaking softly, hoping his calm presence might offer some comfort. "You're not alone anymore," he murmured, his voice almost a whisper against the sound of the wind. "Help's on the way, big guy. You just need to hold on." The bear didn't respond, but its breathing seemed a little less strained, a little steadier. John remained by its side, his eyes scanning the horizon as he waited for the rescue team. Time seemed to stretch as he stood there in the quiet of the forest, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the cold air. Every now and then, the bear would shift, its muscles twitching in discomfort, but it didn't try to rise again. John knew he couldn't leave the bear alone. Not now. He had to stay with it to ensure it didn't spiral into further panic or exhaustion. His thoughts kept racing. How long would it take for the rescue team to arrive? Would they make it in time to save the bear from its injuries? His eyes darted nervously to the edge of the clearing, scanning for any sign of help. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope that the strength of his decision, the compassion that had driven him to act, would be enough to save the life of this creature, this wild spirit that had been so cruelly trapped and hurt. The journey to the wildlife rescue clinic was a blur for John. He had done everything he could, but now it was in the hands of the experts. The bear had to survive this. or everything he had risked would feel like a futile attempt. The clinic's team was already waiting, their faces grim but focused. The bear was swiftly wheeled into the emergency surgery area, and John, despite his exhaustion, stood in the background, waiting for word. He could feel the weight of the responsibility bearing down on him. He had made the choice to help, to step into a situation that could have gone wrong at any moment. And now, it was time to wait, to trust that the professionals would do what was needed. The hours that followed were a blur of activity, as the clinic's veterinarians worked tirelessly to assess and treat the bear's injuries. John was kept informed through occasional updates, but nothing prepared him for the severity of what they discovered. It wasn't just the barbed wire that had torn into the bear's flesh. It was the infection that had set in, the slow, gnawing effect of being trapped for days without food, water, or the ability to tend to its wounds. The infection had spread to the bear's leg, making it even more difficult for the veterinarians to treat. They worked in a frenzy, cutting away the damaged tissue, cleaning the wounds, and carefully stitching the bear's flesh back together. John couldn't help but feel a knot of guilt twist in his stomach. He had thought the bear had only been trapped for a few hours, maybe a day at most. But the veterinarians informed him that the injuries were consistent with days of suffering. The bear had been enduring torment for much longer than anyone had imagined. Its body was weak, its spirit clearly broken by the experience. John's mind kept flashing back to the image of the bear, collapsed in the snow, unable to rise, and he wondered how much more it had suffered before he found it. How had he not seen the signs earlier? Had he failed the bear by waiting too long? But the doctors reassured him that the bear had a chance, that it was strong enough to survive the procedure, and that, with time and care, it could heal. They would do everything they could, but it was still too early to say how much permanent damage there might be. Still, there was a glimmer of hope, something John held onto with both hands as he waited. As the bear slowly stabilized, John's thoughts began to shift. He had heard rumors, whispers of illegal trapping in the area, but he had dismissed them as isolated incidents. Nothing to worry about. Now, as he listened to the veterinarians talk, the pieces started to fall into place. They told him that, sadly, the bear's injuries weren't an isolated case. There had been an alarming increase in reports of animals caught in traps recently, both predators and prey alike. Some were rescued in time, others weren't so lucky. It seemed that someone, or several someones, were setting traps in the wilderness, targeting the animals that roamed freely. John's blood ran cold as the weight of this new knowledge settled in. He had lived and worked in these forests long enough to know the rhythms of the land, the pulse of the wild. But this was different. This wasn't just a random accident. It was a deliberate attempt to harm the creatures that called the land home. John felt a sense of anger welling up inside him. Who could do something so callous, so cruel? And how many more animals were out there, suffering in silence, trapped in the same way the bear had been? As the night stretched on, John found himself pacing the clinic's waiting room, his mind racing with questions and theories. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bear's suffering was just the beginning, that this wasn't just a random act of cruelty, but part of a pattern, one that could threaten the fragile balance of the wilderness he had sworn to protect. The news of the trappers' activities spread quickly, and soon, it wasn't just the clinic that was focused on the issue. Local authorities, wildlife officers, and even conservationists were drawn into the investigation. It became clear that this was no longer just a rescue mission. It had become a battle for the safety of the forest's creatures, a fight to ensure that something like this didn't happen again. But for now, John's thoughts remained on the bear, and as he returned to its side, his heart lifted slightly at the sight of the creature's steady breathing. The fight for its survival wasn't over yet, but for the first time since he had found it in the snow, John allowed himself a small measure of hope. The image of the injured bear lingered in John's mind like a haunting shadow, a reminder of the cruelty that had invaded the wilderness he had spent his life protecting. The forest, once a sanctuary of balance and beauty, now felt tainted by something sinister. The knowledge that illegal traps were scattered throughout the area filled him with a deep, simmering anger. This wasn't nature's doing. This was deliberate. A calculated assault on the creatures he had sworn to protect. And John, determined not to let this happen again, decided to take matters into his own hands. The first step in his investigation was to understand the patterns. John pored over maps of the region, highlighting areas where animals had recently been injured or where old, rusted traps had been discovered. He cross-referenced the locations with known animal migration paths, particularly those of predators like grizzlies and wolves. These were the areas where he knew the hunters would strike next, exploiting the natural movements of the forest inhabitants. With a plan taking shape, John packed his gear, hidden cameras, motion sensors, and GPS markers, and set out into the wilderness. The familiar sights of the forest, usually so comforting, now carried an edge of unease. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig underfoot felt like a reminder of the unseen threat that lurked in the shadows. But John pressed on, setting up the cameras with careful precision. He placed them in areas where traps were most likely to be hidden, along narrow game trails, near watering holes, and in secluded clearings where animals often roamed undisturbed. As he worked, John's thoughts were a mix of determination and frustration. The forest was vast, and the hunters could be anywhere. It felt like searching for a needle in a haystack, but he couldn't let that deter him. Every camera he placed was another step closer to uncovering the truth, another chance to catch the people responsible for the suffering. For the next several days, John's routine became a blend of patrolling the forest and checking the footage from the hidden cameras. Each time he retrieved a memory card, his heart would race with anticipation, hoping for a clue, a face, a license plate, anything that could lead him to the perpetrators. But the first few days yielded nothing. The cameras captured images of deer grazing peacefully, birds flitting between branches, and the occasional curious fox sniffing at the lens. It was both a relief and a frustration life in the forest carried on, but the hunters remained elusive. Then, on the 5th day, everything changed. John was sitting in the ranger station, his laptop open as he reviewed the latest footage. Most of the clips were uneventful, the usual glimpses of wildlife going about their routines. But then, one clip caught his attention. The screen showed a narrow trail deep in the woods, the kind of path that was easy to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. The camera had been triggered in the early hours of the morning, and at first, the image was still. The forest bathed in the faint silver light of the moon. Then, movement. A figure appeared, moving cautiously through the frame. John's breath caught as he leaned closer to the screen. The person was wearing dark clothing, their face partially obscured by a hood. They carried a bundle in one hand, a coil of barbed wire, unmistakable even in the grainy footage. In the other hand was a heavy object that looked suspiciously like a trap. The figure stopped near the edge of the frame, crouching low. For several minutes, they worked methodically, their movements deliberate and practiced. When they stood again, John could see the trap now hidden under a layer of leaves and twigs, almost invisible to the untrained eye. The figure lingered for a moment, glancing around as if to ensure they weren't being watched, before disappearing back into the shadows of the forest. John's pulse quickened as he rewound the footage, watching the scene again and again. This was it, the evidence he needed. The hunters' actions were clear, their intent undeniable. The timestamp on the video showed it was only a few hours old, meaning the trap was still there, waiting for an unsuspecting animal to wander into its grasp. John wasted no time. He grabbed his gear and set out for the location, his mind racing with questions. Who was this person? Were they acting alone? Or was there a larger operation at play? As he moved through the forest, his determination only grew stronger. This wasn't just about one trap or one injured bear anymore. It was about protecting the balance of the wilderness, ensuring that no more animals suffered needlessly at the hands of these hunters. The trail to the hidden trap was long and winding, but John knew the forest like the back of his hand. When he reached the clearing, he spotted the disturbed ground immediately. The trap was there, just as the video had shown, its cruel teeth hidden beneath the forest debris. John carefully dismantled it, taking care not to leave any trace that might alert the hunter to his presence. As he worked, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The footage had given him a glimpse into the hunter's methods, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Who was behind this? How many traps were out there? And most importantly, how could he stop them before more lives were lost? The forest around him seemed to hold its breath as John finished his task, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to stop until the hunters were brought to justice and the forest was safe once more. The forest was cloaked in darkness, the moonlight barely filtering through the canopy of ancient trees. The air was cold, sharp against John's skin as he crouched behind a dense thicket, his eyes fixed on a narrow trail ahead. He had been tracking the trapper for days, piecing together patterns from the hidden cameras and footprints in the snow. Tonight, his patience had paid off. Hours ago, one of the cameras had sent a live alert movement near a game trail notorious for illegal traps. And now, John was certain he wasn't alone. The faint crunch of boots on frosty ground broke the silence. John's pulse quickened as a figure emerged from the shadows, moving cautiously but with purpose. The man was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a mask and hood. In his hands, he carried a bundle of gear spools of barbed wire and a heavy steel trap. John's jaw tightened as he watched the man kneel, his movements quick and practiced. There was no hesitation, no remorse. John stayed hidden, every muscle in his body tense as he observed the trapper's routine. He wanted to wait for the perfect moment, the one where the man would be most vulnerable. But the longer he watched, the harder it became to hold back. This wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was about protecting the forest, about ensuring no more animals suffered the fate of the injured bear he had rescued. The trapper bent down, his gloved hands carefully positioning the trap beneath a thin layer of leaves and snow. John knew he had to act now. Silently, he emerged from his hiding spot, moving closer with deliberate, quiet steps. When he was just a few feet away, he spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "That's far enough." The trapper froze, his head snapping up in alarm. John saw the man's eyes widen beneath the hood, the surprise quickly replaced by calculation. The trapper rose slowly, his hands still gripping the trap, his posture tense. "Who the hell are you?" the man growled, his voice low and rough. "I'm the person who's going to make sure you don't harm another living thing in this forest," John replied, his tone steady but firm. He kept his flashlight trained on the man, the beam illuminating the cruel steel teeth of the trap. The trapper sneered. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know who you're messing with." John's grip tightened on the baton at his side. "I don't need to know who you are. I know what you've done, and I know this ends here." For a moment, the two men stood locked in a tense standoff, the forest around them eerily silent. Then, in a flash, the trapper made his move. He lunged, dropping the trap and reaching for something in his coda weapon. John realized too late. But John was ready. With a practiced motion, he swung the baton, striking the trapper's arm and sending whatever he had been reaching for clattering to the ground. The trapper stumbled back, cursing, but John didn't give him a chance to recover. He tackled the man, the two of them crashing into the snow. The struggle was fierce, the trapper thrashing and trying to break free, but John's years of training gave him the edge. He pinned the man's arms behind his back, securing him with a pair of zip ties he had brought for this exact purpose. "Stay down," John said, his voice cold with anger. The trapper muttered curses under his breath, but he didn't resist further. John reached for his radio, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. "This is Ranger John Evans. I've apprehended a suspect in connection with illegal animal trapping. Request immediate backup at my location." The response crackled through the radio almost instantly. "Copy that, John. Backup is on the way. Hold tight." The wait for the authorities felt like an eternity. The only sounds the trapper's labored breathing and the distant howl of the wind. John stood over the man, his eyes scanning the forest for any signs of accomplices. But the night remained quiet. When the backup finally arrived, the scene unfolded quickly. Law enforcement officers took the trapper into custody, reading him his rights as they escorted him to a waiting vehicle. John provided the authorities with the evidence he had gathered, the footage, the locations of the traps he had disarmed, and his detailed notes on the man's movements. The officers didn't waste any time. Teams were dispatched to comb the area, removing any remaining traps and ensuring the safety of the forest's wildlife. As John watched the trapper being driven away, a sense of relief washed over him. The man's arrest wouldn't undo the harm he had caused, but it was a step toward justice, a step toward restoring balance to the wilderness. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, John stood alone in the clearing, the snow around him marked by the footprints of the people who had just left. The forest seemed quieter now, as if it too was exhaling in relief. John knew there was still work to be done, more traps to find, more protections to put in place. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The fight for the forest was far from over, but tonight, he had won a battle. And as he turned to make his way back to the ranger station, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. The wilderness was his to protect, and he would do whatever it took to keep it safe. The wait for the authorities felt like an eternity. The only sounds the trapper's labored breathing and the distant howl of the wind. John stood over the man, his eyes scanning the forest for any signs of accomplices. But the night remained quiet. When the backup finally arrived, the scene unfolded quickly. Law enforcement officers took the trapper into custody, reading him his rights as they escorted him to a waiting vehicle. John provided the authorities with the evidence he had gathered, the footage, the locations of the traps he had disarmed, and his detailed notes on the man's movements. The officers didn't waste any time. Teams were dispatched to comb the area, removing any remaining traps and ensuring the safety of the forest's wildlife. As John watched the trapper being driven away, a sense of relief washed over him. The man's arrest wouldn't undo the harm he had caused, but it was a step toward justice, a step toward restoring balance to the wilderness. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, John stood alone in the clearing, the snow around him marked by the footprints of the people who had just left. The forest seemed quieter now, as if it too was exhaling in relief. John knew there was still work to be done, more traps to find, more protections to put in place. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The fight for the forest was far from over, but tonight, he had won a battle. And as he turned to make his way back to the ranger station, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. The wilderness was his to protect, and he would do whatever it took to keep it safe. The crisp morning air was alive with anticipation as John stood at the edge of a forest clearing, his eyes fixed on the truck that had just arrived. Inside the reinforced cage was the bear, the same creature he had found tangled in cruel traps, now healthy, strong, and ready to return to its home. After weeks of recovery and care at the wildlife clinic, the moment had finally come to set it free. The veterinarians and wildlife officers worked quickly, unloading the cage and positioning it at the edge of the wilderness. The bear, now an imposing figure of strength, paced restlessly inside, its massive paws scraping against the metal floor. It had regained its weight, its thick fur gleaming under the pale sunlight. But its movements carried an air of unease. The forest was calling, and it was eager to answer. John stood nearby, watching intently as the team prepared to release the animal. His emotions were a mix of pride and nervousness. He had been there from the start, rescuing this bear from the brink of death. Now, as he prepared to witness its return to freedom, he felt the weight of the journey they had shared. "Ready?" one of the officers asked, glancing at John. He nodded, his voice steady. "Let's do it." With careful precision, the team pulled the lever to open the cage. For a moment, nothing happened. The bear stood still, its powerful frame poised in the shadowy confines of the enclosure. Then, slowly, it stepped forward, its large paws crunching against the frost-covered ground. The bear hesitated, sniffing the air. Its dark eyes scanned the clearing, its ears twitching at the distant sounds of the forest. Each step it took seemed cautious, almost reverent, as if it were reacquainting itself with the freedom it had nearly lost. The tension in the air was palpable, everyone holding their breath as they watched the animal reclaim its rightful place in the wild. Then, with a surge of confidence, the bear moved more deliberately, crossing the clearing toward the dense trees beyond. Its gait was powerful, yet unhurried, each stride carrying it farther from the humans who had intervened in its life. John felt a swell of satisfaction watching the bear return to its element, knowing that its survival was a testament to their collective efforts. But just as the bear reached the edge of the forest, it did something unexpected. It stopped. The massive creature turned, its dark eyes locking onto John and the small group of people behind him. For a long moment, it simply stood there, its gaze steady and piercing. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. John felt his heart quicken. He had spent years working in the wilderness, witnessing the raw, unfiltered behavior of animals. But this was different. There was no aggression in the bear's stance, no fear or hesitation. Its gaze seemed almost deliberate. The team behind John exchanged uncertain glances, murmuring softly, "Is it just me, or does it look like it's thanking us?" One of them whispered. John couldn't tear his eyes away from the bear. He didn't know if animals were capable of gratitude in the way humans understood it, but in that moment, he felt an undeniable connection, a silent acknowledgement that transcended language or species. "Maybe it is," John replied softly, his voice thick with emotion. The bear held its gaze for a few moments longer, then turned back toward the forest. With a powerful stride, it disappeared into the shadows of the trees, its massive form blending seamlessly into the wilderness. The clearing felt strangely empty without the bear, but the air was charged with an unspoken sense of triumph. John stood rooted to the spot, his mind replaying the moment over and over. It wasn't just the release of an animal. It was a reminder of the delicate balance of nature and the responsibility humans had to protect it. As the team began to pack up, John lingered, his gaze fixed on the spot where the bear had disappeared. He felt a deep, quiet satisfaction, but also a profound humility. The bear's survival was a victory, yes. But it was also a reminder of how fragile life in the wild could be. Walking back to the truck, John glanced over his shoulder one last time, half expecting to see the bear watching from the tree line. But the forest was still, its secrets safe once more. As he climbed into the vehicle, John felt a sense of closure, but also a renewed determination. This wasn't just about one bear. It was about ensuring that all creatures of the forest had a chance to live free from harm. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but he was ready to face it, inspired by the quiet moment of connection he had shared with a creature of the wild. And as the truck rumbled down the dirt path, leaving the clearing behind, John couldn't help but smile. The bear was free, the forest was healing, and for now, that was enough. As John gazed out over the snowy Alaskan wilderness, now calm after the ordeal, he couldn't help but reflect on the delicate bond between humans and the wild. Saving the bear had reminded him of how interconnected we are with nature, and how every action, big or small, leaves a lasting impact on the world around us. The bear's haunting cry for help wasn't just a plea for survival. It was a wake-up call for humanity. If we don't step up to protect the natural world, John thought, who will? This moment of raw connection was a powerful reminder. The wilderness isn't just a backdrop to our lives. It's a part of us, and it needs our care more than ever. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Join us in sharing more powerful tales like this. Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment that inspires, shocks, or reminds us of the beauty and fragility of the world we share. Together, we can make a difference.